Okay, so I've decided to speak about Indigenous people and criminal justice issues, a topic that I find highly relevant, especially in today's criminal justice system, and also something we briefly touched on in class and that I found interesting to explore further. So let's get into it. A little bit about the problem context and why there is an issue. Is there an actual issue? First of all, I guess there is a variety of relevant issues you could focus on in relation to Indigenous people and the criminal justice system. First of all, you could grab and speak about the unsentenced detention for children at the age of 10 to 17 years of age. That's certainly some rates that are a lot higher than for non-Indigenous Australians. That's something you hear about in the media sometimes as well. And also you could focus on the imprisonment for fine default, which is, I think, a big issue in practice as well for Indigenous people. But what I wanted to focus on are two main components. First of all, the deaths in custody, which has been highlighted several times in research and in the media as well, and then also the imprisonment rates. And first of all, what I wanted to do is talk a bit about the numbers behind this. Why is this an actual issue? And well, first of all, the Indigenous deaths in prison custody, I found some statistics which shows the rates from over the past 40 years or so. And if we look on the right side of this graph, we can see that the rate per 100,000 population is above 4.0. It's about, I guess, something like 4.2 or something like that per 100,000. And that might not seem like a lot, but if we compare it to the non-Indigenous deaths in custody, well, it's a very big difference. It's a very significant gap, because if we look on the right side of this graph, we can see that the number here is more like 0.3, 0.32, something like that. So it's a very, very big difference. It's more than 10 times the difference for Indigenous people compared to the non-Indigenous people. So this is in terms of deaths in prison custody. If we then zoom in on the imprisonment rates, I found some of the newest numbers in this field as well. If we look at, first of all, the general imprisonment rates, well, it's 225 persons per 100,000 adult population. In general, meaning both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, as I understand it. And then if we look specifically at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, i.e. the Indigenous people, well, it's more than 10 times higher again. This time it's 2,701 persons per 100,000 of this adult population, which again shows a significant difference. So this is just to highlight and show that there is definitely an issue here. And now I guess the question is, why do we have these significant differences in terms of the deaths in custody and the imprisonment rates for Indigenous people? What is going on here? And that's what we'll look into a bit now. So I've tried to make a distinction between procedural possible reasons for this general overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, not specifically for the deaths in custody or for the imprisonment rates, but just kind of more in general this significant overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. And this distinction I tried to make is between procedural and structural or underlying reasons. I have to say, though, that it's difficult to make a clear distinction. There are certainly some overlaps between these two, so it's more like an overall distinction and not an exact science in relation to this distinction. But if we start by looking at the possible procedural reasons, I should say, well, first of all, we have this issue of over-policing, which has been debated a lot in research as well, and it's I guess there is not a general consensus maybe, but a lot of researchers have found that there is a tendency to over-policing in Indigenous communities. And sometimes a tendency of what you could call racial profiling maybe connected to the fact as well, it's obviously complex, and it's difficult, and maybe also has to do with the lack of indigenous police officers. Could be a factor as well, but there's certainly in Australia and in other countries as well been this tendency to over policing in communities with a lot of indigenous people. On the other hand, we have also seen under policing in some areas, and what does that mean? Well, that means that the experience, at least, of some indigenous people has been that when the police is actually needed, they haven't been there, they haven't showed up. Specific experiences are related to family violence, for both women and children. That's been a debated topic, and I guess that you can relate that to the overall purpose of criminal law, which is partly to protect the population against criminal offenses. And is that really effective is if the police is not there when they're needed? I guess that's a question that can certainly be raised in these cases of what you could call under policing. It's not something that I've found strong evidence about. It's more like individual and sometimes communities experiences, especially in remote areas in Australia. And then another issue, I guess, is public intoxication. I think it's been prohibited it's not prohibited in most of Australia anymore, but certainly from a historical perspective that has been a big issue, and still is in some parts of Australia, and some of the places where it's now, I guess, legal to be publicly drunk and stuff like that. The police could switch focus into other minor offences, and that, so essentially the issue can still be there, even though public drunkenness might not be prohibited anymore. And then also bail research does show that indigenous people are more likely to be refused in terms of bail applications. So that's a separate issue as well for this, in terms of this overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. And then also, I just generally believe that this tough on crime approach we see for the politicians and the policymakers in this day and age, and this kind of zero tolerance approach we see, I think that has a big impact and effect on these indigenous communities as well, given the statistics I showed earlier, highlighting that the indigenous people are highly overrepresented. I guess then the tough on crime policies will hit the indigenous communities harder than the non-indigenous. So those are some of the possible procedural reasons, I guess you could call them, and again, with some overlaps, we do have some more like kind of structural or underlying reasons as well. I've tried to highlight a few here. We have the question of the juries and how they are made up. We've had a decision, R.V. Woods and Williams in 2010, where the argument was raised against the kind of Juries Act that was inconsistent with the Racial Discrimination Act, because it wasn't racially balanced, essentially because there are no indigenous people in most of these juries, which could be an issue for the jury to understand the specific cultural differences for the indigenous people and the specific circumstances in relation to that. But the court essentially found that an accused person has no general entitlement to be tried by a jury that is racially balanced and is having representatives related to the accused person. So essentially, there is no entitlement to have a jury with indigenous people, even though the accused person might be an indigenous person. So that was what we could make out of that decision. Also, we have the question of fitness to plead, the fitness for trial. We have a High Court decision stating that there can be other reasons for a lack of fitness to plead than mental illness, and the High Court is said that language difficulties can make it impossible to make a defense, which is certainly relevant for indigenous people who can have severe language difficulties, especially in these legal settings. Which leads me to the next point, I guess. A lack of proper interpreters could be an issue as well, more like kind of structural problem for the indigenous people in the legal system, both in the civil litigation and especially in the criminal justice system, which is more relevant in obviously in this subject. And I guess also a lack of access to legal representation, which I think is a general problem. I think the legal aid models could be improved generally. I don't think that's something that only relates to the indigenous people, but I think, again, as some of the other components, I think it becomes more clear and highlighted when we speak about the indigenous people, because they are so overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So if we move on finally to some of the possible solutions, I guess the short answer is that there is no simple solution. If there was, I guess it would have already been implemented. So unfortunately that is not the case. We have had this Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody come up with more than 300 recommendations. It's been a while now, 35 years, and a lot of the recommendations from this commission have been implemented actually, but as the numbers show, it hasn't really had any effect. And some of the recommendations I think are still relevant. And I think that the implementation could certainly be improved, including the access to legal aid, which again I think is a general problem in the criminal justice system. Not specifically an issue for only indigenous people, but I think in relation to the indigenous people, I think it's important to make sure that the legal aid that is accessible is also culturally appropriate, and that there is access to legal aid where the legal assistants understand the indigenous culture and the specific issues of those cases. And then also one of the, some of the recommendations were targeting the use of arrest and detention, and kind of recommending that it should only be used when absolutely necessary, as a kind of a last escape, and not the first thing you go to, which I think, again, these numbers indicate that hasn't really worked out, even though it's partly been implemented in Australian law. I think it certainly could be improved. And also I think part of the solution still could be the recommendations regarding decriminalization of minor offences. Again, could be these fine default cases in public drunkenness, or offences related to these issues, kind of minor offences, because that's in practice a big issue for indigenous people, and I think that has to do with these kind of socio-economic factors as well, that they are more exposed to some of these minor offences, and then also addressing some of these more systematic disadvantages, which again is a general perspective. It could be something as simple as proper education for these communities, which in practice as well, we've seen that in these closing the gap report as well, is a big issue for indigenous communities. So I think the overall answer and conclusion is that there is no simple solution. If there was, it would have already been implemented, and there would be no issue. But I think the overall solution is a mix of these different factors, and I think it requires a focused work over a number of years, and more focus and resources into this topic. And then finally, I've just put up my references here for this presentation. And thank you. That's it.